Let's get into my first review of Season 4 of The Twilight Zone. And of course, as is customary, I'm going to start by talking about what I knew about this episode before starting it. Before I started it. And here's a different kind of a change up for the show this season on Anthology. I have pre-recorded all 18 of my, what I knew before going into the episode. So instead of just stumbling through it, I am going to play a clip of me talking about what I knew before going in to Season 4's episode In His Image. So I'm going to go ahead and play that clip right now. Okay, so what I knew about In His Image before watching it for the first time was a lot of nothing. With much of Season 4, I know nothing about a lot of these episodes. I think that's because it's the hour-long format, and because of the hour-long format, A, it's much maligned from the fan base, it seems, and B, it's something that's not really conducive to the marathon. So I feel like it's not very big in the cultural lexicon or in the fandom's their consciousness as they talk about the Twilight Zone. So that is what Season 4 has going against it in terms of pop culture or cultural significance that trickles down to me being a first-time viewer of the show. So I think a common thread you'll see this season on the show is that I'm not going to know a lot about these episodes. So within His Image, I can kind of just infer from the title that it's maybe about a scientist who creates something, either a robot or some kind of entity that he or she creates in their image. So, well, he, because it's in his image, creates in his image. Maybe it'll be a play on kind of playing God because made in his image. That's the best I can think of. I don't know if it's going to be a situation where, if it is that, I don't know if it'll be a situation where the creation becomes a Frankenstein's monster or becomes something of danger to others, or if it's something that is, it would be interesting if it's like an allegory for fatherhood where the creation, whatever it is, I'm going to just assume that it's like a robot. The creation becomes autonomous and wants to forge its own path and not be pigeonholed to its creator's expectations of it. I think that would be an interesting story to tell. But that's what I know about In His Image before going into it. So yeah, let's see if I'm right. All right. And thank you, Matt, from the past for sharing that. So that's what I knew about this episode going into it. And it's so interesting to hear that played back because there are certain elements that I actually kind of feel like I was not on the money about, but I was pretty close to some elements of the episode. So that was fun to kind of listen back. So having said all that, let's get into this episode. So as is customary, I'm going to read the plot summary courtesy of Unlocking the Door to a Television Classic by Martin Grahams Jr. Here we go. And I should have probably pre-recorded this too, but I didn't. So here we go. Alan Talbot, tortured by the strange sounds in his head, murders a pestering old woman in the subway. Wanting to leave town with his romantic interest Jessica, he decides to pay a visit to the aunt he hasn't seen in a while. Arriving in his hometown, Alan finds things are not exactly the same as they were when he left. Observing his impulse to murder and his insistence that the town isn't the same, Jessica leaves him. Alan injures his wrist, revealing fake skin and wires instead of blood vessels and veins. Following the clues, Alan looks up the residential addresses of Walter Ryder and pays him a visit. There, Alan is shocked to learn that he was born just 8 days before. Walter explains that he fulfilled his childhood dream to construct an artificial man. Escorting Alan to the delivery room, Walter explains how he constructed Alan after years of research. He created the memories, including an aunt that never existed and hometown memories from 20 years previous. But something went wrong. A few days ago, Alan attacked Walter and ran off. Walter admits luck had a great deal to do with the making of Alan, but cannot explain the murderous impulses Alan continues to have. Maybe he made Alan a bit too human. Before Walter can dismantle Alan and discover what is causing the problem, Alan starts to brawl with Walter, smashing the lab to pieces. Back at Jessica's apartment, Walter visits her, apologizing for the nightmare the other day, and promises everything will be okay, while Alan lies partially dismantled on the floor back in the laboratory. So, as is usually the case with unlocking the door, some of the details in the plot summary are a little bit sketchy. Like, I don't think he was necessarily going to dismantle Alan. Well, maybe he was, but I don't think it was explicitly stated that he was going to, with the intention of figuring out what went wrong. He really felt like he was more of a resigned genius scientist who had given up, maybe. I don't know, but we'll get into that as I get to the review. So, the talent rundown for this episode of The Twilight Zone is as follows. George Grizzard plays Alan Talbot and Walter Ryder Jr. This is his second of 2 Twilight Zone appearances. We previously saw his work in Season 1's episode The Chaser as Roger Shackelforth, which I believe was the lead role in that episode. That episode was an episode that I wasn't really that fond of in Season 1. And I'm glad that, spoiler alert for the review, I'm pleased that this episode is actually really good. I'm very pleased with this episode. But George Grizzard also appeared in one episode of One Step Beyond in 1959. And co-starring as Jessica Connelly is Gail Kobe. This is her second of 3 Twilight Zone appearances. We previously saw her in A World of Difference in Season 1. Next we'll see from her is Season 5's episode, The Self-Improvement of Salvador Ross. And she acted in a lot of television in the 50s and 60s before transitioning over into becoming a television producer in the 70s and 80s, most notably working in the soap opera kind of arena of television. Some of her soap opera producer credits include Guiding Light, The Bold and the Beautiful, and Days of Our Lives. So that is Gail Kobe's resume there. Featuring in this episode as the old woman is Catherine Squire. This is her second of 2 Twilight Zones. She previously appeared in last season's One More Pallbearer as the teacher that the man brings down to the crazy cellar. Also appearing as Man, the man who lived in the house, is Wallace Rooney. This is his third of 3 Twilight Zones. We previously saw him in Young Man's Fancy and the Rip Van Winkle Caper. And rounding out the cast is James C. as the sheriff. This was his only episode of The Twilight Zone. However, he did appear in one episode of One Step Beyond in 1959. And writer for this episode was Charles Beaumont. This was based on his short story, The Man Who Made Himself, which was originally published in the February 1957 issue of Imagination. And this is pretty interesting. Some trivia about this episode in terms of the writing is that Serling had originally adapted the short story way back in 1958, like even before The Twilight Zone first came on. He adapted it into a plot synopsis so that he could present it to the head of CBS as part of as part of a packet of a proof of concept for The Twilight Zone. And in the interim, between then and now, there were attempts to secure the rights. At the time, he wanted to secure the rights to adapt it in the first season, but those fell through. But since Serling, since Beaumont was on board for being involved in season 1, Serling always thought, well, we'll eventually get The Man Who Made Himself into the Twilight Zone at some point. And sure enough, they did, way in the 4th season. But what's interesting also is that in season 2, the episode The Lateness of the Hour, it shares some pretty interesting plot similarities to this story. And it was so much to the point that Charles Beaumont's friends assumed that episode, The Lateness of the Hour, was adapted from The Man Who Made Himself. And so much so that they were asking, like, why weren't you credited with this? Like, why did they change the man to a woman? Why did they do this? And then Charles Beaumont's like, no, it wasn't my story, guys. Like, it's not what it was. That's not the story. It's close, but it wasn't. So that's kind of interesting. And director for this episode was Perry Lafferty. This is his first of 3 Twilight Zone episodes. An interesting fact is that those 3 Twilight Zone episodes are the first 3 episodes of season 4. So we're going to be talking about Perry Lafferty the next 3 episodes of Anthology. It's kind of interesting. So he directed he directed 3 episodes, the 30 Fathom Grave and Valley of the Shadow. And I have 3 pieces of trivia that I'm going to basically share 1 piece of trivia each episode. So the first piece of trivia I have for this is that Perry Lafferty was the former father-in-law of William Shatner. His daughter, Marcy Lafferty, was married to William Shatner from 1973 up to 1996. So that's an interesting piece of trivia about Perry Lafferty. Okay, so that is the plot rundown for this episode of The Twilight Zone. Let's get into my review, my thoughts on In His Image as a first-time viewer of this episode. So here we go. First episode of season 4. Obviously, the introduction, the theme music has changed. We get the iconic door, the eyeball, the E equals MC square equation, the sound effects and everything. I did my best to do that for the intro to the podcast proper. Hopefully I don't get a copyright strike or anything like that. But it's very interesting. It's very fun for me to finally be in this point where I see this iconography at the beginning of the episode. And to be honest, I really struggled with whether or not to, and I'm still kind of struggling with that because this episode hasn't come up and gone up yet, but I'm struggling with whether or not to refer to the Twilight Zone in the episode titles of the podcast as Twilight Zone or The Twilight Zone. According to trivia, they dropped the, I think it was a CBS mandated thing, and it was one of those things that, Herbert Hirschman wasn't really fighting against, and I think Serling was kind of against it, but Serling wasn't there to veto it. I'm not sure. I'm a little rusty on the data for that, but nonetheless, it is kind of patterned as Twilight Zone in the opening credits, and it's referred to as such. So I'll probably end up just having it be Twilight Zone, or maybe for sake of uniform episode titles, I'll do The Twilight Zone. We'll figure it out. I'll figure it out here in like an hour or two when I post this episode and solidify it. So anyway, this episode opens with a middle of the night or early pre-dawn morning. The hotel with this guy spraying down the front. I don't really know what that was about. Just like spraying water on it. I don't know. But anyway, we get our introduction to Alan Talbert. And he is just going to the subway. And when he gets to the subway, it's him and an older woman. And this old woman is pestering him about his health, her dead husband, the Bible and God and everything. And I've got to say, I could devote an entire episode to just this scene, because this is such an interesting scene. This is such an interesting way to bring us into Alan Talbot's story, and an interesting way to bring us into this episode of The Twilight Zone, which I will try my best to kind of communicate that or bring that out in this review as I go through it. But basically, this opening scene, like the way that she's speaking to him about God and about how she saw God and it was revelatory, and like all she wants to do is praise God and praise his good work. And she's saying these things while she's unknowingly speaking to this imperfect work of a godlike scientist. By the way, I'm going to be spoiling the entire episode, of course, so I'm sorry for that. But yeah, there we go. So she's speaking to the product of an imperfect, godlike scientist who wanted to make a perfect specimen. And then what I find so interesting is that she then preaches to him about the Bible. In particular, she references Leviticus chapter 5, verse 2, which preface this right now. I am not in any way a biblical scholar whatsoever. So I'm going to try my best to not condemn my soul to hell by just butchering this. But the actual piece of scripture is, quote, or if a soul touch any unclean thing, whether it be a carcass of an unclean beast or a carcass of an unclean cattle, or the carcass of unclean creeping things, and if it be hidden from him, he also shall be unclean and guilty. Which, that is so interesting. That is such an interesting piece of scripture to bring into this episode, because it brings to mind whether or not Alan is responsible for his actions, because he is the product of an imperfect scientist trying to protect himself or perfect himself through the creation of something meant to be better than him. But he's created Alan in, quote unquote, in his image. So he's destined by default to be imperfect, to have those imperfections that Walter himself has. So that's all to say that it's interesting to me that she quotes, not only that she quotes that passage in particular, because I'll talk more about that as we go on, but it's interesting to me that she quotes the Old Testament in itself, like the Old Testament itself, all told, because again, not a biblical scholar, but Old Testament God is the guy that flooded the earth and killed everything, except for two animals, and Noah, and his kids, but two of every animal, not two animals. But anyway, that is so interesting because the episode ends with Walter killing Alan, killing his creation. I just found that to be kind of interesting. So obviously, if you guys haven't caught on yet in this analogy, Walter is the god of this story, and he creates Alan and then destroys Alan because Alan isn't the perfect creation that he hoped he'd be. And then Walter then creates a new life for himself by just taking on the identity of Alan and being with Jess at the end of the episode. So he is creating a better life for himself and presumably correcting the imperfections he has, loneliness, violent ideations, by taking Alan's place. And I just find that interesting because also in that regard, like if you, again, nowhere near biblical scholar. Like I'm not even a religious person, but the idea that this is a story about a man who has created something and then kills that creation, and then in a way to make it, in a way to replace that creation with something that's even better, he puts himself into the mix. He brings, like he takes on the mantle of his creation, like the idea of it. It's like in the Bible, like in the stories, like in the New Testament, Jesus is God and the Holy Spirit and all of that. It's really interesting to me if you dig in deeper to it. But nonetheless, the scene is insane because she is proselytizing to him. She shoves this flyer in his hand, and she's like pleading with him to praise God and everything. And he's just like, I've had enough of it. Just leave me alone. I just want to be left alone. And then he throws her in front of the train and kills her, which is so insane to me. Like this is such an evocative or provocative and unique open for the Twilight Zone. And I can't wait to kind of talk more about it as I go through this episode. But for now, let me go ahead and play the opening narration from Rod Serling that happens after the murder of the old lady.
What you have just witnessed could be the end of a particularly terrifying nightmare. It isn't. It's the beginning. Although Alan Talbot doesn't know it, he's about to enter a strange new world. Too incredible to be real, too real to be a dream. It's called The Twilight Zone.
So not much to go on there with the narration, not much to go on in terms of what to expect going forward in the episode. But I do think it's interesting that he says it's called The Twilight Zone. I don't know anything. I don't know if there's anything to this, but like my theory is that they needed to record these intros on a timetable because of because of Serling's teaching obligations. So maybe they didn't have the official title of this episode yet. And so it's just because like right there, like it could have ended with him saying it's called In His Image. This week's story is called In His Image. Like he has done in the past, but here it's just like, it's called The Twilight Zone. Which I think that's interesting. I don't know if that's a common thing that's going to happen throughout the season, but I'm curious to see if it is. So the first thing I noticed, obviously, at the beginning of this episode, after the narration, is produced by Herbert Hirschman. I didn't know that Buck Houghton was not involved in this season of The Twilight Zone, so it was kind of a shock to see his name not on the screen, and it's a bummer too because obviously 3 seasons of Buck Houghton producing the hell out of the show, and like it makes me a little bit nervous. It makes me a little bit nervous going into season 4. And so from the when we come back from the narration, from the act break, we are introduced to Jessica. Jess is the paramour of Alan Talbot. We learn through conversation that they have that he's in town on business. He's in town in New York on some kind of business thing. That's what he's said, at least. And she has fallen in love with him. And they intend to marry. They've known each other for 4 days. They intend to be married, and they are planning a trip to Coralville, where Alan is from, so that she can meet his family, and they can kind of just get like a look at what their life is going to be like when they get married. And I really appreciate how this episode establishes that relationship and builds up their chemistry. So the script has to do so much work to make us believe that these two would fall in love within 4 days of knowing each other. And it has this confidence to the writing that makes it believable. Like it makes it really believable because they have such a good back and forth, such a good loving quality to each other that short time span of their relationship is kind of second. It's something that is not at the forefront of the viewer's mind, at least not my mind. So even when like he kind of snaps at her in the hotel later in the episode, it's more about the situation than anything about them as a couple. And he's immediately remorseful and apologetic about it. So it's like this show is on this tightrope about trying to manufacture this genuine love that they have for each other, and this genuine affection and chemistry they have for each other. So because of that, I could see this relationship possibly being a point of contention for some critics of the episode. I don't know how it played or how it plays in the fandom now, but I get it. I totally get that, because honestly, that's hard to defend against or argue against or defend, like the short time frame of it. But for me, I bought into that relationship and appreciated the effort that Beaumont put into making them a believable couple. I bought into it immediately. And what I find so interesting about that is that because of the bigger picture of the story, Alan is a robot. Like he's maybe not necessarily a robot, but he is a duplicate human being. He is a person that is of a man-made creation. He's a machine. And what's so interesting to me, and one of my favorite things about this entire episode, is that Alan is a reflection of Walter. So Walter intentionally programmed Alan to be a Don Juan, as he says later in the episode, to be a romantic who's good with women, because Walter, isn't. And that is maybe my favorite thing about this entire episode, and the thing that I latched onto most. It's that we're subtly learning about Walter, a character we won't meet until the episode has 8 or 9 minutes left to go in an hour-long episode. We won't meet him until the end, and a lot of his dialogue at the end is exposition, is explanatory dialogue. But we learn everything about him through the point of view of a duplicate he created of himself. And that is just so fascinating to me in terms of screenwriting and in terms of storytelling. And if you take it even further, By following Alan, we're learning about the idealized version that Walter sees of himself. So it's not so much that, we're learning about Alan as he is traversing this mystery that he finds himself facing. We're learning about the person who created him, but we're not only learning about the person who created him without knowing that he was created by someone, but we're learning about the idealized version of the person who created him. And so that makes it stand out so much when Walter appears, and when we meet Walter at the end of the episode. Even though we have to learn a lot of, we are faced with a lot of dialogue about the explanation and the exposition and everything, we still have a very, very, very clear picture of who this person is because of the structure of this episode. I just find that so fascinating. And it also makes the cold open of this episode all the more interesting to me because we witness this random act of murder in the opening scene. And then the episode then sets out to make us sympathize with the murderer, not by making it into a thing where it's like, well, she deserved it, or well, this needed to happen, or oh, he's really remorseful about it, so we can give him a pass for committing this murder. Instead, we are sympathizing with him because we're experiencing him as a flawed protagonist. And obviously he doesn't have the knowledge of what he did or the memory of what he did, but it's just interesting to see that, yes, this man is a troubled person who doesn't understand the length to which he is troubled. And at the end of the day, we still see him as a decent human being, a decent person through his relationship with Jess and through his experience trying to make sense of this mystery surrounding him. And all of that occurs before the show completely spins it all around and introduces us to Walter at the end of the episode, who is the actual truly flawed protagonist of the episode. And I just find that to be so interesting to me. Yeah. So that is the introduction of Jess and Alan. And then from here, we get a lot of setup of the mystery, and I'm not going to go scene by scene through it because it really this part of it is the one part of the episode that really felt like it dragged for me, even though it's pretty intriguing. So we have him dreaming in the car as Jess is driving. He's muttering the name Walter and repeating like, Walter, it's not right, send me back, or something to that effect. And she wakes him from the nightmare, and then he's like, yeah, I don't know any Walter, or he jokes with her that it's his brother that has been institutionalized, but then he's like, no, I don't know any Walter. And like, that's all well and good. That's a good reintroduction to this very cool sound design of the wires and the circuitry and the science fiction sound effects, basically. But from here up until maybe the funeral, the cemetery scene, there's just a lot of stuff here that feels a little bit extraneous. So they arrive in Corville, and I like the way that the mystery kind of goes full bore into what he's experiencing, what Alan is experiencing, because right from the outset, we are treated to the mystery as being presented to us as being about him not having real memories of Corville. Like, he is experiencing memories from a week ago that seem like they take place more than 20 years ago. And that's an interesting way to bring us into the mystery of the Twilight Zone in this episode. That is an interesting way. And there's added wrinkles of like, yeah, he still has memories of his childhood, and he's pointing out places from his childhood. And that's mixed in with new buildings and a hotel that doesn't have a restaurant when it used to have a restaurant. So there's a good variety there, but then it just kind of feels like a little bit extraneous in terms of having too many examples to bring us into it. So I don't know. So this part of the episode does kind of drag for me, but it did kind of get my brain working and kind of got me wondering, if this is like, I assumed, judging from the title of the episode, that he is a robot, that he is someone who has been created by a human being and doesn't realize it, probably. So I, at this point, was wondering if all of these memories he has are implanted memories for him. And I do like that the episode does subvert some expectations, because this mystery is initially presented as a Rip Van Winkle-esque story that's even referenced by Alan in the dialogue to Jessica. And that's the most likely solution to the mystery as it's presented to us. And it would probably be the resolution if this was a 25-minute episode or a 22-minute episode. But because this is an hour-long episode, that there's an added element of anachronistic things that really, no pun intended, put a wrinkle in that theory of it being a Rip Van Winkle story. Because those things aren't just his memories from a week ago. Like, he is experiencing this out-of-time element where he feels like he has been transported 20 years in the future. And that's even something that's brought up between Jess and him in this same scene where she's like, well, what if that is the case? Which, by the way, that is also a really great way to further make us more entrenched in or believing of this relationship between Jess and Alan. Because she is willing to just go along with him on this journey. She's willing to entertain the idea of maybe he was like frozen for 20 years. Maybe there is some weird time element at play here. She's not someone who is going to question his reality because she's in love with him and she feels that he is being earnest with her. And so she's along for the ride. She's along for the ride with that. So I don't know. I like that. So, also at this point, that kind of slow unfurling of confusion for Alan was pretty neat and had me invested for sure. And when they arrive at his house, that's where it kind of turns a corner. This really, really reminded me just so much of Walking Distance. Like even so much so that I didn't look up like the filming location or anything, but it looked like the same kind of set, the same, like the geography of it, like the placement of the house in relation to where the camera is, feels like it's set up the same way as the house when he goes up to it in Walking Distance and sees his dad. So it just, I don't know, something about the framing of it just reminded me so much of that. But they go to the house. He's basically trying to break into it, and then he's knocking on the door for his aunt, and a man answers and is like, yeah, I bought this house like 9 years ago from someone that is no one of the name that you just said. And I like that because it does present that new wrinkle to it. It's refreshing the mystery. It's doing a good refresh of the mystery and keeping us in in the seat of the mystery for the remainder of the hour-long runtime. It's just adding new wrinkles, new complications, new complexities, and it really works for me. And then that's where we get an act break. And when we come back, or really at this point, I kind of had some theories kicking around with the mystery. So at this first act break, I thought, this is an intriguing loss of identity story so far. And we have just like in the back of our minds, we have the idea that, yeah, this guy is a murderer. This guy is unstable. He is someone who is a danger to others. And I really like that because we don't know where he is in terms of like what we know what he's capable of. But we don't know what triggers will cause him to do harm against others because it is such a random act of violence at the beginning of the episode. And I also started wondering, at this point, my biggest theory was that I wondered if it was going to turn out to be like Where Is Everybody? Only instead of an astronaut in isolation, I was wondering if this was going to be about a robot that's experiencing these memories and these moments while he is being programmed. So I was wondering if this was going to be a case where everything has been created by his mind, his consciousness, as a playground for him to live in while he's being programmed. And maybe these anachronistic qualities are the memories being adjusted or fixed. I was wrong about that, but I still think it would have been interesting to have a revisit of Where Is Everybody, only from the perspective of a robot being programmed. And I kind of wonder if any other iterations of the Twilight Zone have explored that, or if maybe a future episode does. Don't spoil me if they have, but it would be interesting to see. So once again, we have a little bit of extraneous plot stuff here. So Alan goes to the neighbor and asks the girl there to ask Mrs. Cook, who lives there, if he can use the phone to call the police. And that's when she's like, oh, she died 3 years ago. And he says, no, I had lunch with her a week ago. And like, that's all well and good, but I don't know. It's like, I kind of feel like this is extraneous stuff, which I'll get to in a bit. But really, what I want to talk about this scene in particular is that this immediate pull for him to go to the police is an interesting and kind of slight reminder of that Leviticus Bible verse from the beginning of the episode. And I fully admit, maybe this is a stretch. Maybe this is a stretch that I'm going to make. But I do think that that particular piece of scripture serves as the sort of thesis statement for the story as a whole. So Alan has no memory of murdering the woman. And so when he's faced with confusion over his life and home and this discombobulated sense of himself, he has the very reasonable reaction to want to notify the authorities. He's like, yeah, there's someone in my house. I'm going to go to the police and get this sorted out. But it's not necessarily like the story of a man who's like pure of heart and fully innocent, but a man who has no reason to think that he isn't innocent, I guess. So this is where the stretch is going to be. It's basically like, that's kind of the whole point of that verse. Again, not a biblical scholar, but the idea that, you know, a man who dirties his hands without realizing it has still dirtied his hands and is still guilty. So it's just interesting that this is a personification of that Bible verse where it's like, yeah, this man has completely murdered this woman, has no remorse or knowledge of that murder taking place. And he is so clean of conscience because of that. He's going to go to the authorities to get everything sorted out in terms of what his reality is and what the mystery he has is. And it's just so interesting that's the point of the verse. Like, he's dirtied his hands. He doesn't notice that they're dirty, and so he doesn't feel guilty. But he is still guilty, and he needs to have a comeuppance at the end of the episode. So I don't know. But I did like at this point that, to kind of transition back to the mystery of it, I liked that it's becoming more and more of a like kind of time dilation thing. I really honed in on the fact that, like, oh, it seems like everything that he knows is 20 years old. Like, that's the thing that that line where he says, what if 20 it's like 20 years have gone by. That's something that just kind of stood out in my mind. And it's kind of exacerbated, I guess, or what have you, when he goes to his workplace and he sees like, oh, it's just like, it is rubble, it's dirt, it's nothing. And he's like, I've made this drive for 10 years and my workplace is completely gone and the university doesn't even exist. So I really honed in on that. And at this point I started to wonder if, like, I basically had decided at that point that yes, he is 100% a robot of some kind. He is a man-made like piece of machinery. I didn't know to what extent, I didn't know what the details were, but I just knew like, yeah, he's got to be a robot. And it was to the point that I wished that I didn't suspect that he was a robot, because I feel like it would have been really effective as a twist if it was going to be saving that twist for the end of the episode, because I assumed that this episode was going to turn out to be that, yeah, he's a robot and his battery died at some point and it wasn't replaced for 20 years. So that I thought that that's what was going to be the time dilation aspect. I thought that he was going to discover that he woke up 20 years after he was decommissioned or his battery ran out or something, and all of his memories were from 20 years ago, but a week past when his battery died or whatever. But that wasn't the case. And I don't know. I really held on to that for a while. I still think that would have been pretty interesting and effective, but I actually really like the story, the way it ended up for real quite a bit. So no complaints here. So as he and Jess are kind of working through this, I think this is the point where she mentions like, well, maybe it has been 20 years, like stranger things have happened. I was trying to hold in that cough for so long. Crap. Now I've got to do some editing. Anyway. So let me put a marker here. Okay. So so I think this is where she is saying like, well, maybe it has been 20 years. Maybe something is afoot here. And then we get like this cut to where he's then talking to her in front of where his workplace is supposed to be. And he's saying like, this doesn't hold up. Like the whole idea that he, woke up 20 years later or something doesn't hold up because he hasn't aged. And he also says like, there are no records of me. There's no records that I went to school here. There's no record of a university even being here or anything. And that's all to say that he's already had the conversation with the police. He's already had the conversation with the municipal government of Corville or whoever he has to be in contact with about these things, about the records and everything. And for the Twilight Zone to move in to an hour-long format, and then for them to do that and then not find a way to include a scene of him learning this information is really a shame, and it's probably my least favorite part of this entire episode. Because I feel like they could have cut a couple of scenes. Like I said, there are extraneous scenes that kind of just circle back on the mystery itself, like him talking to the neighbor and the guy in the hotel. I feel like it would have been so much more interesting and thrilling if they had added a scene, if they had removed a scene, or at least a couple of scenes of that extra kind of mystery stuff, and instead added a scene where, like, after Alan and Jess go to the house, have the guy call the police on them, and then have them go to the station and have Alan speaking to the police at the station and finding out this information that, like, oh, I don't exist. Kind of like a person or persons unknown thing where he's learning that, like, oh, I don't exist here. This is weird. I think that kind of scene would have gone a long way, specifically because we had that opening scene of him committing murder. That would have created this tense moment for him when he's talking to the police that, unbeknownst to him, he has committed murder. And like, there could be tension in that moment where it's like, oh, are they gonna arrest him for murder? Is this the turn that the episode is gonna take? So there would have been some very organic and interesting tension built into that scene. And then you could have added into that, you could have had Jess there with him to further cement the idea of them being in this mystery together and being connected in this mystery, or being side by side for this mystery. So, but instead we don't have that. We just have this scene of Alan explaining what he's found out to Jess, and that's a bummer. It's really a bummer, and it lessens the tension considerably for me. So then they go to a cemetery. That's where they get, that's where they find, like, on his family plot, instead of the name Talbot, it's the Riders. And so there's a lot of interesting mystery stuff there. Like, his parents' grave says Ryder, and when he sees Walter Ryder, that triggers something in Alan that has that kind of like that sci-fi thing in his brain. And like, I do like the mystery surrounding Walter and Alan's connection, because, again, like, the episode is presenting this potential out of time story, but it's throwing so much more complexity into the mix that it's really fun. So like, when you think that, oh yeah, he's just a robot that's been deprogrammed for 20 years and now he's woken up and everything's different. Once you get that, you get like so much more complexity. Like, who the hell is Walter Ryder? Who is this family and his plot? Like, is this a completely different reality? Like, what is the deal here? And that conceals the reveal at the end of the episode really well as well, because you don't know which direction the episode is going to take, which direction the mystery is going to take, and where it's going to head from there. And so the police arrive. There's not really much here in terms of stuff. Basically, it's just like the man at the house is like, oh, you came to my house. And then he's like, well, I'm sorry. And he's like, oh, okay, well, that's fine. It's such a weird perfunctory thing. But it is supposed to establish that, this sheriff is not the sheriff that Alan knows. And the real sheriff, or the sheriff that Alan knows, is his godfather. And he's just like, well, he's dead. He's been dead for a while. I replaced him. And again, that's a really interesting way to further deepen the mystery and really kind of pin or point us toward this idea that maybe this is like a different reality situation, an alternate reality, which isn't the case, but it's an interesting red herring nonetheless. Yeah, and it's just like that complexity is really interesting, and it makes up quite a bit for the little perfunctory issues that I had before, the extraneous mystery scenes, the missed opportunity of tension in learning about his history sort of scene. But it's like, I really like it, because it does seem like the episode is presenting one thing and then going out of its way to disprove that thing before unraveling into something else. I really like that. So then we get another driving scene as Jess drives and asks Alan how he feels. Now it's nighttime, and he's just like, I don't feel good. And he starts having another manic episode with the circuitry sounds, the electrical sounds, the science fiction sounds. And he has memories of saying, it's wrong, Walter. And then Walter saying that Alan is going to kill me with that. Kill. Almost like he wants him to kill him, but it's very much like, you're going to kill me with it. But I think the emphasis in the audio is kill me with that. Kill. It's an interesting kind of auditory signal to us that, he has a killer instinct or what have you. I'm not sure. There's probably plenty of psychoanalysis that can be done for that, but I'm struggling with talking about the Bible in this episode, for God's sake. So no pun intended. So at this point, my theory kind of evolved a little bit, and I started to wonder, like, is he actually like the reanimated corpse of a murderer or something? But that's not the case. But the thing that made me kind of think about that is when he has that episode and he is asking Jess to pull over. And something very, very, very minor thing here. I really appreciated that when he's having this freak out and she's like, what's wrong? Like, are you okay? Like, he says, like, he's saying, like, pull over. And she's like, are you okay? And he's like, no, you need to pull over right now. I just like that he acknowledges that she asked a question, because so much in television movies like this, it's this sense of immediacy that's like, oh, I'm having this episode. Do what I say. Just do this. I know what's best. It's supposed to like mark up tension. Like, having someone say like, oh my God, I'm going, like something's happening, and someone's like, well, what's happening? And they're like, no time for that. Just pull over the car. I like that there's like a little line where he's like, no, I'm not okay. Pull over the car, please. I don't know if that's getting through, but I think that's interesting nonetheless. So this is probably my favorite scene in terms of visuals. Oh, one of my favorite scenes, because there's something coming up later that I really liked. When he gets out of the car, he is kind of getting away from Jess, which in itself is an interesting escalation. And like, it is showing that we know in that moment what he's capable of. We know that he is capable of committing an immediate act of murder against someone who is completely innocent. So when he's having this severe of an episode, we are now fearing for Jess's well-being, Jess's safety, Jess's life. And because of that tension is just ramped up so much. And in addition to that, it's interesting that he is now becoming maybe a little bit more aware of what he's capable of in these episodes. And it's not really stating that he remembers the woman in the subway or anything, but I feel like maybe he has like an inclination that it's maybe starting to come to him a little bit. So I don't know. I just like that. And he feels the danger that he's capable of and sends her away. And all the while he's hearing memories of his own voice saying, kill me, over and over again. Very disorienting, very, very cool, very interesting. But my favorite thing about that is it switches into this incredibly interesting POV shot of him going after the car. He runs, like has run away from the car into the tree line, and he is standing at the tree line. He's holding a giant rock with which he is potentially going to bash Jess's brains in with. And then as she's going back to the car, he runs toward the car, and we're in this POV shot of him, like this handheld shot of him running. And it is so, like, I know that this episode technically, I believe, predates like the rise of slasher movies in the horror genre. But that POV shot feels so much like the POV of a murderer going after a victim in a slasher movie that it floored me. It floored me. I thought it was really cool. I thought that the tension of it was exhilarating. I was terrified. It was really cool. And so Jess gets away, but another car comes and almost hits him. And that was a really cool effect. Like, I was like, the immediacy of it was very well done, and the potential danger of it was really well demonstrated. I just really like the way that scene was constructed. And so we close this act with an act break for a commercial where the scene closes with him pulling back the skin of his wrist. And like, it's gross to me. Like it looks like it, because it's, I don't know. It's whatever Walter refers to it as, but he stretches it back and just sees like gears and wires instead of veins and everything. And just like the pain of that is just like excruciating to me, even though I know that it's not painful. The effect is really cool. And again, I like that this reveal happens like just around at the midpoint of the episode, and not at the end of the episode, because here's the thing. I had seen that image before, and I was going to be so disappointed if that was the end of the episode, that like, oh, it's revealed that he's actually a robot. But instead, we now know that he's not human, and we have like nearly a half of an episode left for him to reckon with that, and for him to get more information about that. So it's really, I like that. Again, it's another pivot in the mystery that he is now going to go figure out who or what he is and what or who made him. And again, the episode is refreshing its mystery and keeping the audience on our toes, at least for me. And I appreciate that, because it seems like it was done specifically due to this longer format. Like, I'm happy to see that the show isn't just stretching out the conventional Twilight Zone element, even though it kind of seemed like it was a little bit with those extraneous scenes of mystery early in the episode. But I'm happy to see that the show isn't committing to just stretching that out. Instead, it's showing that they're, at least in this episode, actually adapting the storytelling to the hour-long format. So we're getting different phases of the story as this long runtime runs through. And I really like that. So when we come back from the commercial, I found this so interesting on repeat viewings. So the man who almost hit Alan gives him a ride back to the hotel that we see at the beginning of the episode. And the man is pretty much pestering him about Alan's health and well-being. He's very worried about, like, oh, you could have been killed, or like, are you sure you're okay? You sure you don't want me to take you to the hospital? You sure you don't want me to do this? He is overly interested in Alan's well-being. And at first I didn't really understand what the deal was with that. I thought it was kind of goofy. But then it kind of clicked with me that the driver, that character serves as something of an opposite to Alan and Walter. So Alan is responsible for murder and violence, but he has no memory of it, and therefore he doesn't feel guilty, or he doesn't feel, as the scripture says, unclean about it, and about his actions, his impulses, anything that he's done. So conversely, we have this guy who almost hit Alan in an accident. And even though Alan wasn't harmed, even though there wasn't like the worst case scenario that could happen in that situation, since that didn't happen, like, the guy who drove the car should be free and clear, but he is racked with guilt. He has an overwhelming feeling of guilt over what might have happened that didn't even happen, but what might have happened. And because of that, he's overcompensating to Alan, and he's trying to clear his conscience, because no matter how many times Alan says, like, no, I'm fine, don't worry about it, I even signed a paper absolving you of guilt, like, you're fine, this guy is still racked with guilt because he could have committed murder, or he could have killed someone. Manslaughter. He could have done something, not even manslaughter, really, just, anyway, who cares? Anyway, so he is racked with guilt because of what could have happened, whereas Alan, at the beginning of the episode, feels no guilt whatsoever over something that did happen, and that he has no knowledge of. So I don't know. I just think that there's something really interesting to that, and something really interesting to the way that those character dynamics are presented in this episode. And so then we have Alan alone in his room. He's kind of surveying his wrist and trying to make sense of what he sees, when Jess calls, and she's like, hey, are you okay? I've been calling every 15 minutes. And then Alan's like, just forget about me, please. Like, like, you can leave me. It's fine. You don't want any part of this. And she's like, no, that's nonsense. I didn't choose to fall in love with you, but I did. I love you. I set a doctor's appointment for you for tomorrow, so I'll pick you up tomorrow. And he's kind of surprised by that. He's like, you'll still be with me after all that happened. And she's like, yeah, I love you. And like, it's a very particularly touching scene. It's kind of beautifully done. And again, it reinforces that chemistry and the bond that they share. And I also read in that, like that alone is really, really good demonstration of their connection. But I also read into it that Alan's surprise that Jess will stick with him after all of that, I don't think that that's like this feeling of nobility or like feeling of selflessness that, like, okay, I'm not, you don't want, like you deserve someone better. It's nothing like that. Instead, I feel like that is kind of a crack in the facade of Alan's programming by Walter. What I mean by that, so Walter wanted to create a perfect duplicate who is the perfect version of himself, but Walter is a flawed person with his own sense of loneliness and insecurities, immaturity. Like, he has all of these different flaws within him. So by design, like by just his very nature, he's probably incapable of creating something that is flawless, that is not without its own imperfections, that he is going to pass down to him. So having said that, I don't think Alan's surprise at Jess for still wanting to be with him is necessarily a sign of him being noble or wanting to prioritize her well-being over his happiness. Instead, I read it as Alan inheriting some of Walter's insecurities and personality flaws, and no matter how much Walter wants to program Alan to be a Don Juan and be very romantic and be so good with women and good with other people, no matter what, Walter himself is a flawed human being who can't quite get to 100% there. So I don't know. I thought that was an interesting little blemish in Alan's programming. So following that, we get the kind of climax of the story. We have Alan going to Walter's house. He looks in the phone book, he goes to Walter's house, and he wants the answers. He wants to know what he is, who he is, what's going on. And in terms of cinematography and filmmaking in this scene, when he goes into the house and he's wandering through the hall, I think that this is a freaking gorgeous scene. The way that it's lit, so it's a very dark, almost pitch black hallway. And the light, there's light coming in from a room at the end of the hallway. So there's light coming into that hallway from the room at the other end of the hallway, and Alan is walking toward that light, toward that room, and because of the way it's situated and the way the camera is situated, he is illuminated in silhouette from it. And from there, we have Walter appearing behind him in a slightly dimmer silhouette. That is, it's so beautifully composed because it's almost total darkness aside from just these two outlines of men from the light, like the outlines are made from the light coming from the next room. It is freaking cool. It's incredibly cool. It's incredibly well shot, well composed, and it also does double duty of concealing the identity of Walter and concealing the fact that they are the same person. It's really, really cool. It's really cool. So when they go into the room, we have Walter closing the door behind them, and he is just like, "Hi, Alan. Like, let's have a drink. Let's have this conversation." And from here, it is just a fast-paced dialogue string of exposition. Like he says, Walter mentions that Alan almost killed him with those scissors, and we see like the scar from the attack. And we can pick up that, like, yeah, Alan kind of went after him and everything. And throughout this thing, and then he tells him that, like, this happened 8 days ago. Or he says, 8 days ago, you were born in this house. And Alan says, Alan's retort to that is, "You're drunk." And Walter says, "A little. Won't you join me?" And one of my favorite movies, you guys, one of my absolute favorite movies of the last 10, however many years, 10 years this year, I think. Ex Machina, Alex Garland's Ex Machina, Donald Gleason and Oscar Isaac. It is a beautifully done science fiction movie about this same type of story. And I got such a strong Ex Machina vibe from this interaction because we have this tortured genius who's self-medicating over the implications of his creation and over the implications of his failure to create something that's better than himself or better than what he thinks should be the human standard. And it's just, it just reminds me so much of Alex Garland's Ex Machina, which, by the way, if you haven't seen Civil War, Alex Garland's new movie, I was a huge fan of it. Check out Obsessive Viewer. I reviewed it on that show. Alex Garland's one of my favorite filmmakers, men notwithstanding, but he's great, and Civil War was fantastic. But anyway, so I wonder if Alex Garland took some inspiration from this particular episode of The Twilight Zone for Ex Machina. But anyway, through this conversation, Walter is leading Alan more closely toward the truth, and he's using some interesting analogies. Like there's one that he says, I think Alan says something like, "Who am I? Who am I then if I'm not Alan Talbot?" And Walter's like, who is this watch I'm wearing? Who is the fridge? You're a mechanical device. And I just love that analogy so much. And also I love the deeper existential implications of it, because Walter is dehumanizing Alan. And it's a bit biting in terms of talking to him and like talking to him as if he is not a human being, which technically he's not, but he believes he is. And so there's two shades to that existential thing about Alan call it like basically dehumanizing, or Walter dehumanizing Alan, is that yes, he's coming to terms with the fact that he is not a human being, but also this is a man who's speaking to, for all intents and purposes, his own God. He is speaking to his creator, and his creator is just telling him like, yeah, you're not a person, you're just a thing. And it's wild. Like there is some psychological stuff that can be mined from that, and there's stuff coming that we'll talk a little bit about as well. But it's just, I thought that was just an incredible retort or incredible analogy by Walter in this scene. So again, like I just found it so interesting that this man is meeting his maker, and the maker is tortured by the fact that he made this creation. And again, it goes back to that Bible verse and the Old Testament itself, a God wrecked by his own creation and wanting to destroy it, blah, blah, blah. Just really interesting existential stuff here. And then like the scene ends like this. The way that we get to the act break in this scene is kind of sent chills down my spine a little bit, because Walter is like trying to kind of guide Alan toward the truth of what he is and what he's done. And Walter like asks Alan, he says, do you want to come down to the delivery room, and don't you want to see where you were born? And there's something about that just sent chills down my spine, because this is a man who is maybe not as well adjusted as, well, I don't know if I would say not as well adjusted, but it's just from the perspective of Alan to have the shock of his reality and his creation just suddenly, just like his world has been turned upside down, is just incredible. And the kind of callousness with which Walter kind of talks about that, saying that, you know, do you want to come to the delivery room? It just seems like there's this callousness, this coldness to it that I can't really, I don't know if I can really articulate all that well. But it's mostly because it's going to shatter not only Alan's life, but his perception of reality. And that's heartbreaking, because Alan has been trying to find the truth of what's going on. And this journey toward the truth is slowly shattering his entire world, and is ultimately going to lead to his demise. And like, it's not like this is a man who doesn't have anything worth fighting for. He doesn't have anything. It's not like he's just a loner, because he has Jess. He has someone in his life that cares about him and loves him. And he's just walking into his death, essentially. So that leads us to our final act break in this very long, hour-long episode. And we come back to them going down the stairs to the lab. And again, at this point, the episode is really actually surprisingly working for me, which I'll talk about later. But kind of as soon as Walter revealed himself, I just kind of keyed into that whole tortured scientist storyline. And I just thought that it was really good stuff. And I was really hoping that this would stick the landing in this final act. So let's see if it does. So again, as they're descending the stairs to go into the lab, it's another really effective use of lighting to create silhouettes of the two men. And it is somewhat silhouettes because the light is a little different. But what I found really, really cool about this visually and really interesting visually is that they go down the stairs to the lab, but Alan is hesitant. So he's standing at the top while Walter is descending, and he turns on the light. And there's just something about that imagery that I like. It's kind of like this level of vulnerability or hesitance in Alan. Not so much that he knows what's to come or has any inclination of what's about to happen to him, but it is him being hesitant to face the truth, the actual truth of what he is. So I just found that interesting. So they get down to the lab, and really, immediately from there, it just kind of very, very vaguely reminded me of the set of Dr. Frankenstein's lab in the original 1930s Frankenstein movie. At least from what I remember about it, because that was more of a circular space, but just the slabs with Alan's brothers, as Walter refers to him, just kind of evoked a lot of Dr. Frankenstein, his lab. So we're going through, Alan is asking more questions. He's asking oh, how did you fund this? And did you do this alone? And then Walter's just no, I'm a crazy genius, but people didn't take me seriously, but they still wanted to work for me. I'm very wealthy because I did an invention and it paid dividends and it's really successful, blah, blah, blah. And he goes on to explain with a little bit of pride in his work, which I weirdly appreciated, I think. But Walter talks about how it's not just about creating robots or artificial intelligence. It's about true intelligence. It's about truly creating an actual human being, an actual duplicate of a human being. And there are some issues with that, like the fact that he hadn't been back to Corville in 20 years. So there's a lot of gaps there. There's a lot of outdated stuff that he had to put into the memory. And then add to that the fact that he created fictitious tidbits to fill out the stuff and to compartmentalize some things. So Aunt Mildred is a composite of a bunch of different old ladies that he knew in his life. So that's why she didn't exist. And the university doesn't exist, but Walter had to create it so that he could have give Alan a place to work. So I just like the explanation of that. I thought that was a good way to kind of seal up those kind of loose ends, I guess, especially when the episode was so focused on the mystery surrounding what the deal was, basically. So I don't know. I just really appreciated that. So then that's where we get more detail about what happened 8 days ago. So Walter explains that Alan attacked him with a pair of scissors and ran away. And he said, I guess the reason that he's tortured is that whatever's wrong with Alan is also wrong with me. And he goes on to say, we're all potential murderers, and it's because we have these inhibitions in our minds that that keeps us from killing people, that keeps us from doing these horrid things. I found that to be an interesting take. I found that to be interesting because Walter is admitting that he wants to kill people, but his inhibitions keep him from it. And I don't know if this is necessarily supposed to be just everyone's like this. Or if it's it's a deeper seated piece of information about Walter, where it's maybe he wants to kill people because he's somewhat tortured and because he's somewhat maladjusted, because he wasn't properly socialized. He lost his parents at presumably a young age, and he grew up kind of a tortured genius. And maybe because of that, he wasn't socialized properly. But I don't know. Maybe I'm reading a little bit too much into that. But I did think it was kind of interesting that he's we all want to kill people. Okay, Walter. So this is where this is maybe one of the most interesting parts of this whole episode, is that this sense of this existential nightmare that Alan is experiencing in this moment. So he asks Walter, he's can I be treated? And Walter corrects him in this another cold, crazy cold thing that he says, where he's you mean repaired? And I'm Jesus, show a little bit of tact, man. And so Walter just very plainly and very sadly really says luck had a lot to do with your creation. He says that I was like a blind man with a machine gun, and I kept firing and reloading and firing, and I finally hit the target, but it was off center, and I don't think I could hit that target again, even off center. And holy crap, that existential nightmare, that run of dialogue there is so fascinating to me, because imagine discovering that all of your imperfections like discovering your imperfections, living with those imperfections, living with those things that you can't necessarily change about yourself, and then having an opportunity to meet your creator who is responsible for those imperfections, those issues. And that doesn't even have to be like a religious thing or even a parent/child like dynamic. Just imagine meeting an entity that is responsible for creating you. Doesn't have to be religious, doesn't have to be parental, but just a being who has created you. And then asking them if you can be fixed, asking them like, hey, can you treat me for this thing and make me okay? And their response is just a shrug. Like, how demoralizing, how much of an existential nightmare is that? And then it follows up with Alan responding to that kind of that line with like, you didn't consider this? Like, you didn't consider these things when you were creating me? And again, just that shrug is so interesting to me. It's just fascinating to me. And then from here we get Walter kind of espousing about how he wanted to create a perfect version of himself. And this is where the episode kind of pivots from being kind of a religious allegory, the created in his image sort of allegory thing, to being about fatherhood and about being about parenthood. And Walter is just expressing that he wanted to create a perfect version of himself. That was my dream, a perfect version of myself. I wanted to create something that wouldn't have all of the insecurities, all the issues, everything that I faced in my life. And I guess one of the things that he did successfully was made it so that Alan wouldn't have hangovers if he drank too much, that's something. But just the idea that he wanted to create something that was better than himself, that is clearly a direct allegory for fatherhood, for parenthood, for creating offspring. That is the goal that people do when they want to create life or bring life into the world is to make something that's better than themselves. And I love the disdain that Alan has at this moment where he just responds and says, I ought to kill you. Like, that there's so much interesting depth to that, and the existential threat of it is just so interesting to me. And so Alan kind of talks to Walter and tells him like, hey, I have something to live for. Like there's a woman, I'm in love with her. She's out there. This is real. Like I'm a real person. Or Alan says that, and then Walter just names all of the reasons why it wouldn't work out with her, saying like, well, she'd age and you wouldn't, and you're a machine, so eventually your parts would break down and there would be no way to repair you. And I love, again, that response from Alan where he just says, and all of these things never occurred to you. And it's just it's such an interesting volley back and forth between creator and creation. And the volley that Walter gives him is, I guess I didn't think I'd succeed as well as I did. Like, it's so interesting. And then we're running into the end of the episode, basically, the big climax of the episode, where Alan's solution, at first I thought Alan was pitching the idea of creating a new Alan Talbot, using like the brain of Alan with the brain of Walter to join forces to create a third version of Walter that would take on the mantle of Alan Talbot and create, be the perfect person for Jess. And in that moment, I liked that for Alan. I thought that there was a level of selflessness to it, a level of devotion to the woman that he loved that I really liked. But it also felt short-lived. And then upon reviewing it, because he has the episode that ultimately leads to his death, but I thought that they were going to create a new Alan, but I think that the intention from the start, in that when Alan started talking in that scene, was that his intention was that Walter would take on the identity of Alan Talbot, because he says like, we're going to make a new Alan Talbot. He's going to be the one for Jess. And for the first time in his miserable life, he's going to be happy. And that's him telling Walter, like, hey, you're going to be Alan Talbot now. Because, this is going to be your cure for loneliness. I'm going to give you my fiance, essentially. Which also I struggle to figure out, was Alan just going to die there? Was his intention to die there? I don't know. But in any case, he takes the flyer out from the subway that the woman that he killed handed to him, and writes down Jess's address and phone number and information and everything. And then that's when he starts to have that psychotic break. He gives the flyer to Walter, tells him to leave. They fight, brawl, and then it fades out with no resolution. And then we see Jess's apartment. She gets a knock on the door. We see Alan there, and he's like, "Hey, forget about yesterday. Everything's going to be fine." And then they live happily ever after, as we get the closing narration over the reveal of the dead carcass of Alan, with the exposed wrist circuitry to show that it was Walter who prevailed and is now going to be the man that Jess deserves, I guess. So that brings us to the closing narration. Let's play it from Serling.
In a way, it can be said that Walter Ryder succeeded in his life's ambition, even though the man he created was, after all, himself. There may be easier ways to self-improvement, but sometimes it happens that the shortest distance between 2 points is a crooked line through the Twilight Zone.
All right, and that is the end of the episode. Overall, I felt like this was a very solid episode of The Twilight Zone, and I actually liked it a lot more than I expected to, and it honestly makes me more eager to get into Season 4 proper. Season 4 proper. This was Season 4 proper, but to actually get into Season 4 of The Twilight Zone and really dig into it, even if my voice is going to be just destroyed by doing these hour-long episode analysis and everything. So anyway, having said that, the resolution of this episode, while satisfying, did feel a little bit like the resolution to a half-hour episode and not a full hour-long episode. Like, that could be because we don't... Well, I don't know. Upon first viewing, I should say, that could be because we don't know enough about Walter until over halfway through the episode. But then again, we also get a lot of that through context, through Walter or through Alan just existing. Like, we get a lot of the backstory and the information about Walter. So maybe that's not too bad of an issue. I kind of came around on that criticism, and I honestly was really appreciative of the kind of backwards approach to characterization that Beaumont utilized in this episode. Whereas, like in regards to telling us a lot about Walter through the actions of Alan and leading Alan to Walter, so that the exposition dump, the explanatory dialogue between Alan and Walter wasn't as expository or explanation heavy, because it is more informed by, the background of Walter that we've already kind of had hinted at throughout the episode. So, I don't know. And then the final thing it's not really anything that I'm really going to harp on all that much, but there is probably a read of this episode that seems kind of weird with Walter just usurping Alan's identity to become Alan and get Jess. I don't think that there's any issues there in terms of moral ambiguity or anything, because really, I mean, Alan killed a woman. Like, it's the safer bet, I guess. But Walter does say that, he will tell her the whole story at some point. So there is that to look forward to. But overall, I thought this was a really good episode, like really surprisingly good. And I'm glad that this was the start of Season 4. So hopefully this rest of the season can kind of keep up that momentum and be as good. So we'll see. So that is it for my review. I have